Hey, what's happening, folks? This is the Negro Subversive Podcast, episode 7. In the last episode, we looked at the connections between capitalism and exploitation and the state, and how the state and capitalism reinforce each other and how they both come together to exploit the masses of people. This time around, we're going to look more in detail about how we can build new principles, political principles, and a new political model for our new society. There's no other way to say it. If you want people to be able to participate fully in a system of local direct democracy, they have to have more time. And they have to have jobs that don't make the body weary and don't tax your energy to the breaking point. There's a reason why the lawyer might be more likely to show up to the city council meeting, even though on paper he works 40 hours a week. And the McDonald's fast food worker or the factory worker might not, or if they do show up, they're definitely pulling more weight. They're definitely doing more work, and they're definitely overcoming more to be present. So you do have McDonald's fast food workers and factory workers who are active in their communities, but it's different for those kinds of positions rather than positions like a lawyer. Because one person's job proceeds at a more natural pace. The lawyer either works for his or herself, or they have the labor market power to secure reasonable work conditions. And for the most part, the only thing the lawyer's working is his brains and his vocal cords. A lot of shift jobs don't even give you a standard 2-day back-to-back weekend. And that's assuming you're not working multiple jobs. Even with one job, though, you might have a day off one day and then 2 days or 3 days where you work and then another day off. So it's not like you can just crash on the first day and then do other things that might be intellectually engaging or difficult on the second day. By the way, this is what annoys me so much about the endless social media conversation about whether it's elitist to tell people they need to read. A lot of folks telling folks that they need to read and framing that as some kind of shortfall on the part of those who don't. These are people who get paid to read. They're grad students, graduate students. These are the main people who seem to be most up in arms about this kind of thing. And no, I don't want to pretend that everybody who speaks out of their ass is working 80 hours a week at McDonald's. There are a lot of people who work relatively white-collar jobs or are college students themselves who do have the time to know what they're talking about and choose not to. And if you have time to be on Twitter getting into all kinds of discourses all the time, and if you have the time to make YouTube videos and memes, etc., and if you have time to make TikToks, then you have time to read to know what you're talking about, to know what kind of misinformation you're spreading so that you don't spread misinformation. But that aside, there's a complete failure to recognize how the basic political economics of the way our society is organized, the way this society is organized under capitalism, and how that impacts black folk disproportionately, and how it puts a lot of folks in a position where if they can bother to have any kind of intellectual life at all, it's going to be dominated by memes and Umar Johnson. Because that's the low-hanging fruit. That just validates what you already believe and whatever prejudices you already have. But it also makes you feel like somebody's doing some kind of work to change the unjust situation and circumstance you were born into. And it makes you feel like you're a part of it. Now again, there are educated people who buy into this. I first found out about Umar Johnson in college from my fellow college students, obviously. But as far as the masses of people and the influence he has over some of them, we have to recognize where a lot of the fire and support behind these movements come from. And why when you talk to somebody who is a black working class, They are more likely to have heard of Umar Johnson rather than whatever famous intellectual whose ideas are getting debated in a graduate seminar or an undergraduate seminar. So any kind of scheme for collective self-governance, any kind of order that is not going to have a small group of people called the state making decisions for the rest of society, while the rest of us wander around barely knowing what's going on. Any system that gets past this is going to have to give people the time and space to educate themselves on the issues, to debate the issues, and to actively participate in the work of governing their society, of governing themselves. That can no longer be the privilege of a particular class or a few classes of people. But to speak about education, even if you are educated, and this is an interesting component of how capitalism works, even for the educated who have relatively white-collar jobs, you begin to see this grind culture, they call it. And of course, they jacked both of these terms, grind and side hustle, from us. The grind and side hustle culture. You know, if you're a poorer person, if you're working class, the grind and the side hustle are matters of survival, or they might be the only way for you to get yourself to a position of some kind of social and economic dignity. But this has been appropriated by white-collar folks, and disproportionately white-collar folks. It has infiltrated into the upper middle class white-collar parts of society. It's this idea that if you're doing something, that if you're not doing something that somehow makes money immediately, you shouldn't be doing it. Again, everything comes back to dollarism and the culture of capitalism. So the idea is that even if you have the kind of white-collar job where you have lots of time where you're not actually doing any work, and the rest of the time you can be on Wikipedia or Facebook or whatever, or reading the New York Times, God forbid you spend that extra time that you have learning about the world and the society, which as a voter you're supposed to be helping to govern. No, that time must be spent finding other ways to make money. And again, that's before we even get into the lack of a work-life balance and getting emails at 2 a.m., etc. So everything about the way our economy is designed to function under capitalism and the way it's designed to discipline us and put shackles on us even when we think we're free has the effect of making self-government impossible. True, real, actual, informed, and empowered self-government, it makes it impossible. This goes back to my critique of so-called pro-black people who think that we can't do anything better than to just imitate the white man. The white man system is flawed and exploitative to begin with. Whites just happen to be doing better under it than we are because, to go back to the previous episodes, because they have us to stand on. Back in the 1930s, the well-known English philosopher Bertrand Russell wrote an essay called In Praise of Idleness, in which he argued that by the 21st century, people wouldn't have to work more than 15 hours a week. A good way to think of this is in terms of the self-checkout at stores like Walmart. It's almost hard to believe, but within recent memory, very recent memory, if you got checked out at a store like Walmart, you had to actually wait until a register with a cashier at it was available, and a cashier was available to check you out. There was no option to check your own stuff out. I know this isn't news to anybody, but I'm just setting the scene. So if there were 8 people getting checked out at one time, that means there were 8 cashiers checking them out. Until finally Walmart invented self-checkout. Or somebody invented self-checkout and Walmart adopted it. They're the biggest adopter of it. So now 8 people can check themselves out while Walmart only has to pay one employee to watch them, to make sure nobody's gonna walk through the front door with a PlayStation 2, which had to ring up. Well, PlayStation 2, I'm outdated. See, I don't game. A PlayStation 5, 6, whatever, and then or ring it up as a kumquat. We've bought into this idea that automation means people lose their jobs so much that it doesn't occur to most of us that you don't have to run a business this way. If cashiers owned the store, they would say, okay, so we can check out the same number of customers with one cashier that we used to need 8 cashiers for, so we can find other useful things to do in the store. Or we can just go on working the register as we do, one at a time for 8 people, and we can all work 1/8 as much. So instead of working 40 hours a week, we can all work 5 hours a week and then go do other things in society and have the same amount of money. Now you can take that extra time and go work another job. You can take that extra time and go sleep, play video games, learn to play the piano, whatever. It's your time, and your quality of life will not change at all. But capitalism has converted what should be a brilliant thing, what should be a wonderful thing, this increased productivity, getting more done with less work. In every other area of life, getting more done with less work is a good thing. If you get a Roomba and you had a vacuum cleaner, you don't say, well, let me I used to have to spend an hour a week vacuuming or whatever, an hour a day. I'm just gonna sit here and go make myself miserable because I don't have that hour a day. I don't know what I'm gonna do with myself now because I've been made redundant by the Roomba. I'm unemployed because of the Roomba. No, you say, okay, cool. So that's an hour of my life I can go get back and do something I actually want to do. Since 1948, the productivity of American workers has grown 252%. That means the average person produces almost 2.5 times the value in goods and services as an individual worker could in 1948. If you think in terms of widgets or whatever, cantaloupes, canned goods, for every hour of work done by an individual that could produce one widget in 1948, you can produce 2.5 widgets. Or if you work 2 hours, you can produce 5, because who wants a half widget? A study done recently found that the average person only does actual work at work about 40% of the time. Obviously, this doesn't count for everybody. If you work in an Amazon factory, they're trying to squeeze as much out of you as humanly possible. If you're part of the wait staff at a restaurant, you're probably not sitting around 40% of the time. Unless you work during a non-busy period. But since you probably get paid less than minimum wage, because what? Because the state allows businesses to do that, even though honestly it objectively makes no sense. And so even if you could spend 40% of your time doing nothing, that just means you're losing out on massive amounts of the money and the resources that you need to survive. But for an increasingly large portion of the population, they have jobs which they could do on a weekly basis by just being at work about 40% of the time. So they could have 60% of that time that they spend working doing something else, and just use 40% of the time they currently spend working, and then just go home. But they're required to be there because of this tradition of the 40-hour work week. By the way, it's weird. If you take 40 hours a week and look at 40% of that, it's 16. So it's interesting. I mentioned John Maynard Keynes. I mentioned Bertrand Russell earlier is where I got exposed to the idea. But he was drawing on a study done by the economist John Maynard Keynes. And so it's interesting that somebody back in the 1930s predicted that by the 21st century, we would be able to only work about 15 hours a week because of an increase in productivity, and he was only off by an hour. He was only an hour too optimistic, according to this. But again, this is a privilege that is disproportionately distributed up the ladder, up the social and economic ladder. Increasingly, we have an economy that is bifurcated in two. We have some people who spend 60% of their workday around the water cooler or surfing the internet, and you have people who do jobs that would be a lot easier if more people got hired to do them and they all got decent wages. I mentioned Amazon. The easiest way for Amazon to continue to provide the level of service that it has been trying to provide without having their employees having to urinate in bottles is to hire more people and have each of them do less work or do a reasonable amount of work. But they're cutting costs, which is necessary to maximize profits on paper because that's how they keep the Amazon stock sky high. You can't just have a high profits. Profits have to grow. And again, that's part of that's part of the profit model for Amazon's shareholders. And that gives you another example of how the stock market and the finance industry distorts the economy. But we'll get into that at another point. So yeah, as you can imagine, I think we should look at what direct democracy would look like starting on the local, municipal, and city level. I think that before we start trying to imagine how we would organize things at the level of Georgia or Mississippi or South Carolina, or if the states would combine together into one national territory, we can really just start by thinking on the city and municipal level. We don't have to imagine black control at that level. That already exists in many places. In a few major cities like Baltimore, Detroit, and Atlanta, and in more than 100 predominantly black counties in the Black Belt that stretches from Maryland to Texas. In those areas, black political majorities have been a reality since the end of slavery. Really, during slavery. And if we can get black folks on board in those areas, we don't have to negotiate with anybody else. So imagine a world where folks get up to do 2 8-hour days on the job or back to back, or they can stretch them out or whatever. They get paid enough to live on and have a pretty good life. You basically get the same amount that you'd get if you were doing the job 40 hours a week, and now you can do what you want for the rest of the week. It would basically be the equivalent of a college work study, where you work at most about 20 hours a week, and the rest of the time you're a college student. And not only that, you're not working in a capitalistic firm, you're working in a cooperatively controlled firm, in my mind, under a planned and organized economy. We can get into that later. But suddenly you have time to read books on the issues that are impacting your community. You have time to have those debates, and it's on a productive, informed basis. You have time to read 3 or 4 10,000-word investigative reports, so that if somebody who's been placed in a position of trust abuses that position, you can discover that quickly and do something about it. Or if something that's been set up by society isn't working right, or there's some kind of injustice that needs to be dealt with, you have time to learn about that issue, figure that out, and deal with it. Once you have it on the municipal level, then a group of municipalities can get together and elect temporary representatives to a council made up of groups of municipalities. And then you can have a council above them made up of groups of municipalities, or if you want to organize on the state level, whatever level makes sense, that you have a council that's small enough to be useful but big enough so that power is not concentrated for no reason. And gradually you can get up to even a global level of organization based on a community of democratically run organizations, with each community retaining its basic autonomy and every level of the chain holding the level directly above it accountable. Now, the best way to go into detail about how this could work, and ultimately, I'm not trying to lay out some step by step by step by step. Over time, we'll talk about this more. We'll think about this more. But this is something for us all to think through and think about and figure out precisely how we want this to work. But the basic point here is to recognize that if we're going to be working on building a new society, we should expand our horizons and our formulations of the possible. And so the best way to think about this and think through this is to look historically. That's one way to form a basis. But before I get there, I want to make it clear that this idea that I'm laying out and describing has been called by a variety of names. It's been called democratic confederalism. It's been called libertarian municipalism. Huey Newton referred to it as intercommunalism. Two of the major theories I consulted for this, on top of Newton, were the Kurdish activist Abdullah Öcalan and the theorist Murray Bookchin. I already said that Öcalan is a Kurd. Bookchin is a white American. Now, in the future, we're going to dive into Afrocentrism. And one thing that I'm always very careful of is to not create a situation where every idea and theory somehow leads back to a white man. We all have reason to be suspicious of that. But with Bookchin, it's important to recognize that he got a lot of his ideas from anthropological study and looking at the Western record of how human beings organized their societies historically by looking at societies in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. So in the next episode, we're going to look in more depth at how patterns of organizations, the patterns of organization I've described occurred on the African continent before European colonization, and how African leaders in the period since decolonization have tried to draw on that history through something they called African socialism. That's going to be out next week. Until then, this has been the Negro Subversive Podcast. As always, thanks for listening. All power to the people.